I have the little disclaimer at the bottom, and I always kind of thought these disclaimers were kind of silly, you know, the lawyers made us write them. And then I realized that, that they're actually, it's kind of management 101, right? So in other words, if I say something stupid, it's my fault. And if I say something brilliant, then NREL gets credit. So, so with that, I guess, you know, what's up with the Nexus in the title? You know, you hear Nexus a lot. It's not the bad guy in Star Trek. But the energy is a connection, it's connected to a lot of things. So the Energy-Water Nexus has been talked about since the 90s. The Energy-Water-Food Nexus is a big deal in China. They've been having a lot, or I mean to the UN. The UN has a whole department dedicated to this. In China, they've been having lots of meetings and conferences on the Energy-Water Climate Change Nexus. And of course, people at NREL have been talking about the Energy-Land Water Nexus for a number of years. I started collecting data on this about 10 years ago when I went for the State Department to Uzbekistan, because they have no water. And so how do they make electricity without water? The bottom line is that energy, irresponsible use of energy is connected to a lot of things, and it's a systems level problem. There's not a silver bullet that solves all the problems. So I use the word nexus too. So, I'm going to give a kind of context to everything in terms of water, land, and energy, and then I'm going to go through electricity production and how that affects how we utilize land and water for that, and then fuels production, and then I'll wrap it up. So that's kind of a big overview. So the USGS has 3 categories for water. You're all familiar with surface water. That's the fresh water. That's the lakes and rivers. And so there's surface water. There's water underground, groundwater that's pumped, fresh. There's and then there's saline water, which has over 1,000 parts per million of dissolved salts. That could either be pumped out of the ground or out of the ocean directly. Just to put that in perspective, about 500 parts per million, you probably wouldn't drink it. It would taste bad. Might be potable, but would taste bad. And then the ocean has about 35,000 parts per million. So that's the 3 categories that the USGS uses for categorizing water. These are their big breakdowns of withdrawals. I'll define what withdrawals are in a minute. But basically you have your farming usage here, irrigation, aquaculture, that's like your fish ponds and such, and livestock. And then I kind of group these together because this is the water they pull out and then clean up and chlorinate and so forth and provide to the public supply. And then industry and people also pump their own water that doesn't come out of the public supply. So the big takeaway here is that irrigation, on the freshwater side, irrigation and thermoelectric generation withdraw about the same amount of fresh water. There's a lot more when you add saline water to that. But where does this public supply go? Well, it goes to mostly industry and to us, and the rest is spread out among everything. So if you kind of redistribute that public supply, that's kind of how it breaks down there. So this is withdrawals. So if you look at this picture here, you can see that you're withdrawing water to cool power plants. You're withdrawing water maybe from the ground for a domestic supply, for irrigation, so you're pulling water out and you're using it somehow. So when they talk about water use, they're usually talking about withdrawals, although it can be a broader category than that. Water consumption, on the other hand, is actually what's not returned to its original source. So consumption and withdrawals are 2 entirely different things. So in the case of some power plants, just about everything that you withdraw ends up being evaporated and not returned. With others, you end up returning a lot. So there's a big return to the source. So you might be withdrawing a lot, but not consuming much. You can see the little small smoke there compared to steam there. And certainly, when you're doing irrigation, you're not returning it. It's going into your food, into the soil, and being evaporated. And then your domestic sources typically go down the drain to some treatment facility. They're often returned, but not to the original source. Those are all considered consumption. Use is actually a broader category than withdrawals. We also use water. Fish, nature uses water. Fish like water particularly. But But there's also, you know, recreational use of water. There's a lot of uses of water that don't require withdrawal. So that's kind of the categories. I wanted to kind of make sure we had a clear definition of those. So if we go back to this chart here with the withdrawals, and we say, well, how does this look now with consumption? It actually looks like this. So the water that's consumed by thermoelectric plants is way, way, way less than what's withdrawn. So, and I'll go through that kind of step by step. So one of the things I want to say is that I'll do another disclaimer here. There's people in the audience probably that know more about this topic than I do. I'm going to be painting with a broad paintbrush here, flying kind of high. So I'm going to maybe throw some stuff on a graph and things, and you might have some data points that are different. We can talk about that after, but you know, I'm trying to paint a picture of how land and water is impacted by energy production. So this is not my area of study. It's just something I've been interested in for a decade, so I've been collecting data on. So land areas. So in this figure here, this is for the lower 48 states. The numbers in parentheses are square miles, and the percentage of land area. So Colorado's about 3.3% of the land area of the lower 48. Lakes and streams are about 5.3. Cropland's about just under 20. If we look at what kind of disturbances that man's made, in addition to cropland, is we've paid, and these numbers are really hard to get to, by the way. They're non-trivial to dig up, so I've got a lot of different sources, and I kind of picked ones I thought were the best. But roof area, and Steve back here has helped me dig some of these numbers up. But the roof area, we have about 0.3% of the country is covered with roofs, and about just under 2% is paved area. Now that's all the parking lots and everything. Sometimes you'll see smaller numbers for major highways. So this is everything that we've paved over. Now if we look at in terms of energy, our coal, natural gas, and so forth in power plants, we only used about 0.03% of the area for energy. Hydro, solar, geothermal, 0.01%. Wind, we're now at about 0.6%. Bioenergy is even higher, although this is intermixed with this, and sometimes they're commingled, so don't think of those as two separate things. So just to kind of put some numbers in scale there for you. On the land use, there's an interesting article a couple of years ago, or a year and a half ago, about this phrase I hadn't heard before called energy sprawl, that now land use for energy is the biggest driver of land use in the United States. But keep in mind, as we go through all this, not all land use is single-purposed. For instance, you can run cattle or grow crops underneath wind turbines. Many of us in this room have solar panels on top of our house already. And then, of course, you know, for hydro, there's other uses for reservoirs. And then in terms of bioproduction, energy can be used from the waste products. You don't have to use the food part of the biostream to produce energy. You can also use the waste products. So it doesn't necessarily, you can grow food and an energy crop at the same time. So keep those kind of things in the back of your head. Little introduction to energy, simple definition. It's just the capacity to do work. It can be stored in you have to have a mass to store energy, and it can be stored in a variety of ways. The most common way we think of it is actually chemically, in batteries or in fuels. So most of us drove here in a vehicle that burned some gasoline, and I guess I didn't, but a lot of people did. But so that's the most common way we think of storing energy is chemically. Work is just force exerted over distance. Force is just anything that causes a mass to accelerate. So how do we deal with this energy when we have to have a mass to deal with it, right? So one other point I wanted to make kind of on the introduction to energy is that this is a really cool website, gapminder.com. If you haven't played with it, you ought to go play with it. They have a lot of socioeconomic data in there, medical data, birth rates, all sorts of things, and you can plot just about anything versus anything, and then hit the button, and it'll play it versus time. So you can get a lot of really cool data there. But this is the per capita GDP, so the economy per person around the world, versus the energy use per person. And the colors correspond to the continents they're in, and the size of the dot is the population. So you can see China, India, and the United States. So the basic trend that this graph shows is that if you want to grow your economy, you're going to use more energy, right? That's just the way that's been the nature of economies for the last 100 years. And China certainly has ramped up a lot in the last decade. So you've all seen this one. We always use more energy. The rest of the talk is going to be US-centric, whereas this is a global picture. But we use oil, gas, coal. The relative mixture might change a little bit over time, but every year the people on the planet use more and more energy. So when I get ready to give this talk, some people in this room, one of the guys sitting here in the middle, said, "You're not going to show that really boring flow chart, are you?" And I said, "Well, this is Colorado Renewable Energy people. They want to learn something, so they won't be bored by the flow chart. And plus, I'll show it to them enough times that they'll get it." So we're going to come back to this flow chart. This is kind of the overall big picture. You could think of this column as being energy production, and then there's some you transform that energy into something else, which could include burying plants and biomass things with the right temperature, pressure, and time, and you end up with fossil fuels, so that's kind of a transformation. This is energy storage, electricity, heat, fuels, and then this is the use. This talk is mostly going to focus here. I think Martin's working on somebody else at NREL to kind of focus more on the land and water, especially the water side over here, so I'm not going to spend time over on the use. We'll talk about it a little bit, but we're going to talk mostly about the production side of this. So if you look at this, the sun comes down, it makes plants get buried, they get heated, and some of them turn into coal. So now we're going to talk about coal. So you got to mine the coal, and then you transport it to where you're going to use it. Typically that's a power station, you deliver the electricity. So coal is mined. We have a variety of techniques, most of it in open cast mines, and most of it comes from Wyoming. So there's all this talk about coal mining all over the east and all the politics there, but the big mines are in Wyoming. And most of that coal gets delivered by train. So 93% of that coal goes to make power. So why do we cool power plants? So now those of you familiar with thermodynamics are all going to get bent out of shape because this is not a technically accurate figure, but it's simplified enough that you should be able to get the picture. So basically you take water, you pump it, you make steam, you're burning coal in this case, you use that steam to turn a turbine, which spins magnets and allows you to make electricity, and then you condense it and you go through the cycle again. So if you look at this thing, this is a temperature versus entropy graph, and this is an oversimplified version of it. But the bigger you can make this delta T, this change in temperature, the more energy you can get, the more work you can get out of the system. So that's the whole idea. So there's two ways to make that temperature difference bigger. You can make it hotter, or you can cool it on the backside more. So just to give you an example, you could say, well, why use water? Why don't we just run this to an air heat exchanger to the air and just use air to cool it? You can do that. But people like to use water, and I have an example here because water's good at cooling things. So John, I'm gonna cool you down with some air. See, do you feel cooler? Now I'm gonna cool you down with some water. Oh, I'm just joking. But you would know that from all of you that had somebody throw a glass of water in your face, that water cools you thousands of times more efficiently than air. So yes, you can cool with air, and that's called dry cooling. However, your efficiency goes down. So now you have to burn more fuel to get the same electricity out. So now you have more CO2 emissions and more pollution because you have to use more fuel to get the same energy. So people like to cool with water because water's really good at cooling things. So So now there's two types of cooling on thermoelectric plants typically, in addition to dry cooling. One is recirculating, and the other is what they call once through or open. So in recirculating cooling, you have this recirculating loop, but you have to cool that condenser with a cooling tower that's basically using evaporation to cool it. So while it's 3% of the withdrawals, it's 90% of the water consumption, because virtually all that water you're running into that cooling tower is being evaporated. So in their little picture here that the Unit of Concerned Scientists made, they really did this kind of right. Just about everything you're pulling out here is getting evaporated. Once through cooling, you're just dumping the heat into lots of water. So you run a lot of water through it, dump the heat into the water, and then you get your cooling that way instead of through a phase transition of heating the water up. You say, well, why don't we just do that? We're not evaporating all that water. Well, it turns out that water can be up to 20 degrees Fahrenheit warmer when you return it than when you pull it out. By the EPA Clean Water Act, that's defined as being thermal pollution. So they haven't built many of these once-through cooling systems since the 70s because of this thermal pollution problem. So most of the newer plants are all built this way, which uses more water than this, consumes more water, right? This plant is pulling out a lot more water, but they're also returning it. So now this graph, so the other graph, I told people I was going to give this talk, they said, well, you're not going to show a double log plot, are you? Nobody understands a double log plot. I said, well, these are smart people, they'll get it. Plus, I'll give them words to understand it with instead of just numbers. So let me explain this. This is the square feet per megawatt hour needed, and this is the gallons consumed, not withdrawn, the gallons consumed per megawatt hour. So usually this lower axis, if you look at most data on land use and energy, is in acres per megawatt hour. But how many people know that there's 1,000th of an acre is 43 square feet? Right? I think you can relate to square feet better than acres. So I'm using square feet. Here's some words then, if you don't want to look at the numbers. An iPad's a little less than a square foot. A bath towel is a little bit more than 10 square feet. A cubicle that many of you work in is about 100 square feet. This room is about a little over 1,000 square feet. And a football field is less than 100,000 square feet. So there's some words to give you references to what these double. So this log just means that every one of these increments is 10 times bigger than the previous one, right? So, but if you don't like numbers, you can read the words. What's a megawatt hour? A megawatt hour is approximately what a 1 kilowatt PV array will do put out in 7.5 months in Colorado. It's like running your microwave continuously for 42 hours. It's 33 charges on an electric car, or the equivalent energy of 27 gallons of gasoline, or it's about a month of an average US home consumption of electricity. So that's kind of, you could think of the megawatt hour as, that's what the average person uses in about a month. Not Steve Stevens, of course, you know, if he's way below par on that, and just like golf, being below par is a good thing, so that wouldn't be Steve's house, but the average US home. So when you look at these numbers, they're all normalized to a megawatt hour. That's about what that number means. So what do these different gallons mean? A milk truck's about 7,500 gallons. A barrel is 42, like a barrel of oil. A gallon's a gallon, amazing that. And then a cup, a teaspoon, and a drop. So now you have words that you can apply to this double log graph. You don't have to look at numbers. And then keep in mind that these numbers might seem kind of small, but that's for 1 month of average US home consumption, electricity consumption. We have 126 million homes in the country, and it doesn't count transportation and heating. So these numbers get really big really fast when you start having to share with the rest of the people in the country or the rest of the people in the world. So that's the double log plot. How does coal fit into this? So coal mining, turns out, doesn't take a lot of land per megawatt hour because the coal's right there, and you dig it up, and in Wyoming, they just go in and just dig it up by the truckloads, and it's pretty energy dense. But it does take quite a bit of water, several gallons per megawatt hour. Burning that coal takes more land and more water. Keep in mind, it's a factor of 10 every decade there. And one of the reasons coal plants take so much land is you got to get a train in and turn it around. So if you actually look at the property boundaries of a coal plant, they're actually fairly big because if you covered that same land with PV panels, you could get about a third of the energy out that you would of the coal plant just because of the area they have to take in to move coal around. Now, I wanted to say one other thing about this double law graph, and then I'll stop explaining what all the graphs mean, and we'll just start going through the technologies. So this talks about annual water and land needs. So if you take the area of coal mines that are active, and you divide it, and you take that area and divide it by the megawatt hours of coal, the energy equivalent, for that year, then that's how you get this number. Same thing with PV production and wind production. It's how much area and the megawatt hours of energy produced off of that area per year. So these are annual numbers. So you might have square foot per megawatt hour per year might be a way, but it's an annual thing. So back to our busy flow chart here. We made coal. We heated and made steam. Steam's in quotes. I'll tell you why that's in quotes in a bit. And then that steam spins magnets and makes electricity. So what if we talk about nuclear fuels? Now that's one that's not run by the sun. It's run by nuclear materials, primarily uranium-235. But again, all it does is heat up steam to spin magnets to make electricity. So that's what a nuclear reactor does. Nuclear reactors, basically, our basic design, there are others around the world, is you have fuel elements, which have lots of uranium pellets in them, and you have some moderator called control rods that you can put up and down inside of between these fuel rods and regulate how fast the reactions happen. And so that's basically the way a nuclear plant works. And you have, so there's that reactor, and then you have a cooling loop here, an intermittent cooling loop that helps you regulate the temperature of your reactor, and it takes the excess heat to a steam generator, runs it through the turbine, spins magnets, and then you backside cool it. You're going to see this steam a lot. You backside cool it, right? So that's where the water comes in. So where does uranium fit on, or nuclear generation of electricity fit in onto our double law graph? It's here. I'm pretty confident about these numbers. This is a lot less confident. Getting the land required to do nuclear mining or do uranium mining, those numbers are a little harder to come by. I finally settled on that. If you had numbers that are different, it wouldn't surprise me. So again, it's very energy dense. You can get it out without using a lot of land, but it does take a lot of water. There are some techniques to refine the uranium where they fill pits with water, let it evaporate. They use a lot of water to get the ore before they ship it to processing. So the water could be a lot more than that depending on the techniques. There's kind of two ways they mine uranium now. Open pit mining or hard rock mining, but also they do a lot of injecting water in the ground now, and they create slurries in situ, and they pump the water that's uranium rich out, and then they send that to processing. So that's called in situ. In the United States, in Canada, and Australia, they do it with oxygenated water, usually hydrogen peroxide to do that. But in other parts of the world, like Kazakhstan and others where there's lots of uranium, they actually use sulfuric acid to melt the uranium out. So be glad you're in the United States. But there's a lot of water used to get mining, and of course a lot of water used to make electricity from it. So back to our busy flow chart. Our next one is natural gas. Now natural gas has lots of uses, as Steve was just talking about, right? So you have these plants that go underground, that are grown by the sun. Ancient plants become coal, oil, and natural gas. But natural gas gets used a lot. Used to heat your house, to cook your food maybe. It could be used for lots of different industrial processes. It's the feedstock for a lot of chemicals that are made. So natural gas is like a magic fuel. But it also can be used to heat, make steam, spin magnets. And this is why the steam is in quotes, is that it may not exactly be steam. It may be just hot air. So you get this gas either out of a gas well or out of a bleed off of an oil well. You separate it, you process it, you send it through the system. You could send it to people that are big consumers that know what they're doing with it. Or if you're going to put it in a distribution system to sell to you and me, you have to put a mercaptan smell in it first so that you can smell it. It has no smell on its own. So for safety concerns, then you know you have a gas leak. So they have to add an odorant, and then they send it off so that we can use it. So this is the distribution. These are the major transmission lines. There's 300,000 miles of natural gas transmission lines in the United States. Almost 2 million miles of little feeders that come to your house. So there's lots of gas in the ground. Some of it's under roads. It's dual use. It's not like this is taking up land that's not necessarily undisturbed. This is a really interesting plot. I really like this one because it tells two stories. One story is many of us got interested in energy back in the 70s. And it's like, oh, we got to do something. Well, this is a hopeful slide in a sense, because if you look at what industry was doing on their trajectory before the 70s, they were going to use a whole lot of natural gas by now. But becoming more energy conscious, and prices, but also energy conscious, they've actually not followed that trend. And the same thing with everybody in the room, right? We became more energy conscious, we insulated our houses, we put in better windows, and instead of following this really remarkably linear trend like this, the home use of energy, of natural gas has flattened out or gone down a little bit. And that's what the population is going up. So I think that's a hopeful story. It says, hey, we can do something about this, right? The other story that comes out of this slide is that for electricity generation, it's been going up and up and up and up. So it's actually surpassed coal, so in terms of the BTUs. So we use a lot of natural gas for electricity power generation. Now here's the quotes of steam or the steam in quotes. So many of the electricity much of the electricity generation by natural gas is you bring air in, compress it, you heat it up, and then you run that hot air and combustion products through a turbine, like a jet engine, basically. So instead of being steam, it's hot air. But it's still a medium that's a vapor medium that's turning a turbine, which is making electricity, right? So then that gets exhausted. So water is still used in this, though. Many people think, well, this doesn't use any water because it's a gas turbine, it's not a steam generator. But they still do intercooling at this point, where they take some of the load off the compressor. And some of them also cool the air intake, because there's an air mass going through this turbine. So if you want denser air going through it, the best way to do that is to cool it before you load it into your compressor, so you can get more air and more molecules of air in. So there's some, not all, but in the drier climates, and especially in hot days, they'll cool the intake. But there's still water cooling going on at the intercooler. This is a combined cycle power plant. So here's this gas turbine. You pull the air in, you go through the turbine. Now you have all this hot gas coming through your turbine. Well, you can run that through a heat exchanger, make steam, and run a steam turbine. So this is what they call a combined cycle power plant. And then, of course, that's cooled on the back end, just like the nuclear plant or the coal plant. So where does natural gas fit into this picture? The mining and transportation and distribution of natural gas takes a little bit more area. It's not as dense. Takes a little less water than the other technologies. And of course, burning it, you'll notice the nuclear plant takes a little less land than the coal plant. Well, they still have to have buffer zones for security. They store all these nuclear materials on site, so they have to have security about buffers and so forth. The coal plant's a little smaller yet, or the natural gas plant's a little smaller yet, because you don't need as much security, or you don't need you can pipe it in, you don't need trains to turn around. So that's kind of where those two fit on that. I will say one thing, however, that a small total footprint is not necessarily unobtrusive. I took this picture flying over Kent, it was close to Kent, Utah. And this just went on for miles and miles and miles from a jet. I couldn't get a very good picture, but this is the best picture I got. These are gas pads, right, and all the interconnected roads. And I've been to counties where you see things in their publications or on their websites where they say things like, oil and gas pads and the roads cover less than 1% of our county's area, right? Well, when I walk down the trail, a spider web covers less than 1% of my trail, but it still annoys me. So just because you're not using the big total area doesn't mean there's not a lot of issues with how that land is used. So back to our busy flow chart. If we look at geothermal now, this is using the heat out of the earth. Again, this is not a solar technology. The heat of the earth is 90% there because of radioactive decay of uranium, thorium, strontium, things in the earth decay, radioactive decay and heat up the earth. So how can we use that geothermal energy? Well, one way is just to use the heat directly, like a heat pump. So some of you might have heat pumps, geothermal heat pumps to heat your home with. The other way is to, again, make steam, spin magnets, and make electricity. So there's just some temperatures to give you an idea how hot the earth is at different depths. How can we use that heat? I mentioned the geothermal heat pump. It's basically a refrigerator hooked up backwards that goes in your house for heating. So if your house is if it's cold, you take heat out of the ground and you dump it into your house, just like your refrigerator takes heat out of the refrigerated space and dumps it into your house. Here you're taking heat out of the ground and dumping it into your house. Conversely, you can do the opposite. If it's too hot, you can take that heat out of your house and dump it into the ground. So these work really well, especially in northern and southern climates where you have a strong heating or cooling load. A lot of people here, some people in this room maybe even would advocate for Colorado, just use good passive solar design, you don't need to do this. That might be true in Colorado, but there's other places in the country where this is really affected. You get about 4 to 1 heating units per energy used compared to gas heating. So in terms of your total energy you're using, this is much more efficient than natural gas heating and forced air. So most of the geothermal plants that are making electricity in this country are flash steam. So you take hot water out of the ground, it's high pressure and fairly high temperature, and you make steam, you run your steam turbine, and you got to come back and cool it, and you need a cooling tower again. So steam turned into turbine, spinning magnets, and making electricity. So cooling tower, it's a pretty common theme. This is how we like to make electricity. We like to spin magnets. So where does geothermal, I'm not going to put the heat pumps for your home up there because it doesn't really fit with this big power production kind of part of the graph. Again, you can see all the water is fairly similar for these different types of things. Keep in mind that these icons are big. So dry cooling would be down here, and a closed loop cooling would be up at the top. So you might say, well, yeah, but dry cooling uses a fraction of what wet cooling does. That's true, but it's over a factor of 10 on that icon. So keep that in mind. So uses less land because you can put the power plant right over your well. So you don't have to pipe stuff in and so. So we're still spinning magnets here. Another way to make steam is using concentrated solar power. So you can also make heat with that and use the heat directly. Oh, sorry, that didn't turn out as good. But so this is what they call a linear or parabolic trough. So you use the sun to make hot water or a hot fluid. You run it through a heat exchanger. You make a turbine, steam turbine turn, spin the magnets to make electricity, and again, you're going to have some kind of cooling tower. Or you might have a power tower. This one shows a dry cooling. So one of the reasons you can get away with dry cooling a little bit more on these power towers because you're making so much heat, so you can get things really hot, so you don't have to cool as much necessarily. But again, you're making steam, turning the turbine, making electricity. Or you can have a Stirling dish. So this is basically each one of these reflectors here, each one of these parabolic dishes has a Stirling engine at the middle that's a different working fluid, usually helium or hydrogen or air, and then that cycle doesn't use water. So this is really a dry technique. So these are ways you can use the sun. So where do they fit in on our little graph here? So if you're using these wet cooling techniques, you're going to use a lot of water. Now, Chuck's in the audience, so he can probably fix these numbers for me. But these numbers here are to wash. So it takes a few gallons per megawatt hour to clean the optics. So this is all about, this is not for operation, this is for, because these concentrators, they have to track the sun. And so you want to have them very clean so that you're getting as much sun as you can. And so for washing the panel, the mirrors, that's what that water is for. I've seen some reports where they say, oh, we can clean these mirrors a lot, using a lot less water. So it's possible that concentrated solar power uses much less water than what I'm showing here in terms of the Stirling dishes. I'll just leave that number though, because we have a couple NREL reports that say that's how much water it takes to wash, so I'll just leave it there. So how else do we spin magnets? Well, one of our best techniques is hydropower, right? So hydropower, you're all familiar, you build a reservoir, you build a dam, you let water run through your turbine, and it spins magnets, and you don't have to have a cooling tower, you don't have to have fuel, you just use the gravity, the potential energy of the gravity of the water to come through there. If you have never toured a hydro plant, go do it. Lots of places give tours. It's really cool. This is Bonneville one on the Columbia River. They're really impressive. They just sit there and they run and they're cool and they run water and they make electricity. The problem with them, however, is that once you dam up a river and you set that water still just sitting there in the sun, you actually get tremendous evaporation losses. So the amount of water you need per kilowatt hour to give you a month worth of electricity is actually pretty high compared to even burning coal. And of course the reservoirs are really large. But they can be used for fishing and recreation and water supply and water control for irrigation, so they have other purposes. So, the other way we spin magnets is with wind. We just had a little update on wind. I still don't believe those prices, Steve, but that's a different question. so we can take and spin magnets by having the wind turn a turbine. One of the people are always asking, well, why are these turbines so big? It turns out that if you want to mine the wind, the better mine is up high. Better wind source is up there. It's faster. It's more laminar. It's just better wind producing power. So the higher you can get these turbines, the more reliable power and the more power you're going to get out of them. I'll take a little side note. We used to have a booth at the stock show, and we'd have a poster for wind, bio, and solar. And all these ranchers would come up, and they just didn't understand solar because it wasn't spinning magnets. So, but they liked wind because it spun magnets. They understood how to make electricity if you're spinning magnets. So this just gives you a scale of how big some of these wind turbines are. The biggest ones now are bigger than your jet engines, your jet planes. So they're really big, and the offshore ones are really huge. So wind is is way down here. It takes more land, but it's just ancillary use of water. There's no water required to generate electricity from wind. I will say, though, however, that they actually only use this much land. But you can't space them that close together. You have to keep them spaced apart so that the turbulence from one turbine doesn't affect the other turbine. So you actually need to occupy the larger number to get that much power, but the useful land that's impacted is maybe 1/100th of that. So it paints a little bit of a bad picture. You still need a lot of land to get a lot of energy off of wind, but you're not using that land up. You can still use that land for other purposes. So I made a joke about people didn't like, the ranchers didn't like solar because they thought it was magic because photovoltaics make electricity without moving parts. But that's the way it works, right? You can think of a photovoltaic device as a solar battery. In fact, I often joke that back when we first started the industry up, Bell Labs called it a solar battery. We should have stuck with that. Instead, we call it photovoltaics. Nobody can pronounce it or spell it. It sounds snooty. It just doesn't have good marketing appeal, right? So we should have kept it as a solar battery. You could also think of a photovoltaic device as an LED hooked up backwards. And in fact, it is. The better solar materials, you can hook them up backwards, run a current through it, and you get light out of the solar panel. So they're very analogous to an LED. No moving parts. All the work is done at the cell level. You string cells together in a module, string modules together into an array, and then you can hook that array up. You can either hook that array up on a top of a building. This is a soccer field in Taiwan. Or you can put them out in the fields. This is a field in France, right? So this is typically what people think of as utility scale installation. It's pretty obtrusive to the land. This is not, right? So where does PV fall in this? A little bit more water than wind. In places where you have to clean it a lot, you might have a lot more water, but less land, about a tenth of the land that wind uses. I will say that if you follow my numbers at the beginning, you'll say, shouldn't that be shifted to the left a little bit? Yeah, but on these utility scale projects, you have to have clearances to get trucks in, you have to have clearances to get utilities in. So the land, if you take a total solar plant area per megawatt hour, this is the number you come up with, not just per module, right? Because your module is perfectly efficient at the module scale, but you have to have other areas involved with your solar plant. So let's talk a little bit about fuels. Fossil fuels, here we're going to go to our petroleum. You know, basically you pump oil, you refine it, you send it through the system. You either manufacture other products, or you send the gasoline and you use it for a variety of purposes. So we're all familiar with kind of the life cycle of how oil works. This is how oil was pumped in the early days. You stuck a straw in the ground and it came out. Then when we figured out that all the good places to stick straws in the ground were used up, we had to get more sophisticated on how we got oil, so we had better straws. And we even had offshore straws. And you can see we've got deeper and deeper and deeper now, and they're talking about like even 4 to 5 miles deep offshore now. So these depths that we're going and the measures we're going to get oil have become more and more extreme. You've probably heard about tight oil. This is oil that's kind of in oil shale. You can get that out by fracking. A more efficient method is this steam-assisted gravity drain. So you drill a pipe where you get the oil out, and another pipe with steam, and you inject steam into the shale, and then that heats the ground up, and you can get the oil out of the shale that way. You often see a lot of flaring of natural gas. There's natural gas that comes out of this. And so a lot of times they're doing this shale gas where they don't have a pipeline to collect the natural gas, so they flare it. I just read that around the world where they flare, natural gas for either startup of a line or maintenance, or in the case where they don't have a place to harvest it, that CO2 emissions are the equivalent around the world of 77 million cars just from flaring natural gas from the petroleum industry. Oil sands, you've probably heard about all the oil sands in Canada. Here you're digging the ground up. It's a tar pit. You heat it up, you add water, you have to do a little bit of refining, and then you can send it in a pipeline to go to a real refinery. So basically you have to do some refining on site to turn it into what, in Texas they used to just stick a straw in the ground to get, because it's full of sand and other junk, so they have to get that junk out of there. So that's the oil sands. Here's just, I always like this, you know, you have a lot of different products here, but out of a barrel of oil, but 95% of it goes to the transportation industry in one form or another. So when you're talking about oil, you're really talking about transportation. So where does oil fit in here? To mine it and get it around, it's a little more energy dense than natural gas, so it takes a little bit less area and water than natural gas. If you're doing the shale gas, it takes a little bit more. If you're doing the oil sands, it actually takes less land but more water. It takes a lot of water to make oil from the sands. But you're just right there. You don't have to put a well there and a well there and a well there. You just dig up this whole space so that the density is pretty high. So now what about biofuels? So biomass can be used for a lot of things. You can burn it directly and make heat. That's probably our oldest way of using energy. If you've ever been at a campfire, you appreciate that. You can take that plants and algae and stuff, and you can convert it to liquid fuels, which you could then use in transportation. Or you can burn pine beetle-killed trees, like they do in gypsum, and make steam and spin magnets and make electricity. So basically, everything you could do with oil or other energy sources, you can do with a plant. You can make liquid fuels, you can make electricity, you can make products, bioproducts. There's lots of work on this now. I'm trying to make plastic things out of corn or other materials. In fact, the chemical companies are spending a lot of money in trying to figure out how to not use petroleum as feedstock for their products. And of course, you can burn it directly. One of the advantages to biofuels is it's a drop-in replacement. So because it's like petroleum-based products, you can just drop it into the existing infrastructure. If you want to move to a hydrogen fuel cell or even compressed natural gas, it's a different infrastructure. It's not the same infrastructure. So that's always one of the attractive things about biofuels. So now I'm going to shift from icons to pictures, because I'm not really talking about delivering energy, I'm talking about growing crops here, okay? So if you grow algae in vertical stacked units, it's comparable to kind of concentrated solar power in terms of its land use and water. You don't get much evaporation off of this because they're in tubes, right? But if you grow algae in open beds, you can use a lot more water and use more land. Corn is about, switchgrass. Switchgrass is about here. Corn uses a little more water, and then soybeans are up there. So the takeaway from all of this is that when Chuck over here invents something down in this corner that uses very little land and very little water and produces no CO2, he's gonna win the game, right? So this is good down here, and this is not so good. So I'm just about done. Sorry, Steve. And of course, you can burn it. You can burn it to make electricity. So we didn't talk about these technologies: ocean thermal energy conversion, wave and tidal. Those are not land-based. We didn't talk about energy storage or energy use or solar fuels. But keep in mind that with each one of those icons I showed, it's a big range, right? So it's maybe a factor of 50 or 100 in that range. The best megawatt hours are the ones not needed. Paul Torsolini at NREL calls that megawatts. On the production side, if you save energy, you can now see you're saving land and water. right? So the less energy you use, the more land and water you're saving. On the use side, saving water saves energy. Each state ranges about 1 to 5% on their electricity use just to move water around. California's at 5, Colorado's quite a bit less because we have good gravity feed here. But so reuse, reduce, conserve, energy efficiency, Steve's preached about that. But each technology must balance these different things, right? So if you're replaced with a lot of water, maybe water's not as big a concern with you. If you're replaced with really expensive land, maybe land's very concerning to you. So all of these things have different regional considerations. But we still need research. This is my last slide, so we still need research. I'd be glad to switch hats and talk to you after at the snack area about this. But as Steve said, wind and solar have made it in terms of cost. You know, they've driven the costs way down. They beat nuclear and coal, competitive with natural gas. Liquid fuels, biofuels are always kind of struggled. They're chasing, in terms of cost, they're chasing the cost of oil. That can change, be quite volatile. But no matter what, if we want a clean energy future, existing technologies are only probably going to get us about 80% of the way there. So we still need to do research. We still need an NREL to finish the race, basically. Thank you.
We'll take questions.
I'm wondering, you mentioned cooling towers a number of times from various sources. Does the steam and ultimately water emitted from all of those, from all kinds of generating plants, whether it's nuclear or coal or combined cycle, have any significant, does all that water have any significant effect on the hydrological cycle?
Well, it absolutely it can, especially regionally in a given region. But it also is a greenhouse gas. So globally, it has an effect of warming the planet because you're putting more water vapor in the air. But yes, in certain regions, it makes a big impact.
Generally speaking, based on this presentation, which is the least nasty for the environment?
That's a complicated metric, actually. So, for instance, some people say, well, wind kills a lot of birds, right? So you hear that a lot. Let's see here. I think I got a slide on that. I don't know how to click ahead without just going one at a time. There we go. So here you've got wind turbines killing birds, and here you've got domestic cats, right? Well, I'm just saying, birds fly into man-made structures, whether they be wind turbines or they clear out 300,000 dead birds out of New York City that fly into windows every year, right? So the metric you use to what's bad for the environment can be very complicated in a hurry. Certainly, technologies that don't use a lot of water, for the reasons that we talked about, are good. So wind and solar PV are very good for not using a lot of water. CSP technologies that don't use a lot of water. CSP has its big advantages. So concentrated solar power is basically, is that west? It's basically good from here like this part of the country, right? So we have a lot of direct sunlight. Well, there's a lot of land in that part of the country. So you can put these technologies there without having a big impact. So that's not an easy question to answer.
You had one slide where you were showing the gas turbine, the jet engine, essentially. But I noticed that in that slide there was an oil tank, and it looked like an oil line feeding into the turbine. Can you explain why?
Some of them are dual fuels, right? And I just stole that picture from one that happened to be dual fuel.
Okay.
Yeah. A lot of island nations, like Hawaii, uses a lot of fuel oil to make, and to make electricity too. So Puerto Rico, other island nations that don't have the resources, the most energy dense thing you can ship there is fuel oil. So they'll make electricity with fuel oil. On the mainlands, they tend not to use that.
You mentioned the evaporation of from reservoirs.
last year I was surprised to hear somebody say that we really don't have a real good idea of how much evaporative loss there is from Lake Powell. I figured this would be down to the gallon. It would be something easily measured. What do you know about that? About what we know about evaporative losses?
If you get a hold of me after, I can give you my references for where I got those numbers from. Keep in mind, my graph was double log plot, so that big icon, they can be off by quite a bit and still be under that icon. So, so the numbers I have are over quite a range with different estimating techniques for evaporation. So.
But what I wanted to know, someone told me the other day that while you could be wasting water with the steam generator, how much? But then so does a boiler, you know, like how much?
Basically, if you're spinning magnets and you have to cool on the backside, you're using water to make electricity, right? So either you're doing it or the power plant's doing it.
Could you say a little bit about biomass and fuel cells? And
fuel cells. Okay, fuel cells are just starting to. I skipped fuel cells. I had them on my busy flow chart. They're just starting to really be used, mostly in transportation. Primarily, they're hydrogen fuel cells, so they recombine hydrogen and oxygen to make water. But they're primarily like right. I only talk about technologies that are making more than a couple % of our energy use, and we're not even anywhere close with that on fuel cells now. But we're doing a lot of work with fuel cells at NREL. There's lots of studies to be done in terms of their longevity. You have to have pretty pure fuels to go into them, or they get poisoned. So you can't just use junky gas in them. And
20 years from now, what kind of efficiency might we see with fuel cells?
Well, they're fairly efficient now in the operation. How you get the fuel is a different source. The thermodynamically, if you're going to make hydrogen, say, from splitting water, it doesn't make any sense to use a fuel like coal or nuclear materials to make that power to split the water to use back in a fuel cell. But if you can get that fuel from if you can get the fuel for the fuel cell, for instance, hydrogen, without using a fuel for wind or solar, then it starts to make sense. So the auto manufacturers are completely split on this right now. Half of them are pushing towards fuel cells, and half of them are pushing towards batteries. Some of them have a foot in both camps. But some of them are betting on hydrogen fuel cells for transportation. Some are betting on the battery technology.
It's my understanding that an ordinary fuel cell working with hydrogen can also work with carbon monoxide.
You can, yeah. We're doing those studies too. Carbon monoxide, however, is a toxic gas. So do we really want toxic gas in your
But it
car?
comes naturally with pyrolysis.
It does, yeah.
So the other question was about combined heat and power.
Yeah.
If some of these systems were combined heat and power, would you think that would make a big difference?
It would make in some areas it would make a very big difference. In Minneapolis, it would make a huge difference. They could use a lot of heat in the winter in Minneapolis. If there's industrial uses for low-grade heat, they could make a difference where you have those industrial uses.
They're almost required in California now.
Yeah, they're not building a lot of plants in California. And Russia's been doing this for decades, and a lot of European countries. They tend to put their power plant closer to their population centers so they can pipe the heat over and use the heat. We tend to put our power plants as far away as we can so people don't see the stacks. So it's a little, the infrastructure is a little harder in this country unless we start building power plants closer to where the heat could be used. Or we have to figure out a way to transport heat a long distance.
Got a question back here on Brown.
Hey, I was just wondering, in what environments do solar panels need to be cleaned the least, and what factors go into how much they need to be cleaned and how dirty they get?
So that's actually a really complicated question, and we could spend the rest of the night talking about it, but let me just say this. The places where they need to be cleaned the most are places like Saudi Arabia. And they've actually, because when they have a dust storm, it's like nothing we've ever seen. and they've actually gone to dry cooling. They have brushes that just brush the dust off. So they actually are developing techniques in the Middle East to clean heavy soiling without using water at all. So there's whole programs on this whole soiling issue. And I've personally, I've had 10 years, I've had modules, and sometimes I'll have somebody watch my meter, and I'll go up and wash them off, and you can't see any change. So they look dirty to me, but I don't see any difference in the output from cleaning them or not.
On black? Okay. Yeah, and maybe if there's less...
I thought you were Jamie.
I just changed my name for the next 60 seconds. And maybe if we reduce some of the particulates from fossil fuel pollution, we'll need less water to clean off the panels.
Well.
Can you pull up your cool log chart again?
The last one?
The one with all the icons.
Okay. So ask your question while I'm getting there.
Okay, so it strikes me as it's a really nice tool to compare qualitatively all of these things. But
qualitatively, yeah.
But then it's a little bit misleading because in that lower left corner, well, first two things. One, we have a lot of land and we have less water, so maybe the y-axis is really the most important to base judgments on.
Depends on where you are. I'd say if you were in some expensive land property in the Bay Area, you might think you have more water than
but because you can easily transport electricity via wires, we have lots of land elsewhere. But the chart doesn't really give you any indication that that's more important. And then the other thing is, for wind and solar, they're not sitting in that lower left corner very much, but they could be. Like you said.
Well, they can't be, right? I mean, your solar flux is a kilowatt per meter squared, so that's all. That's it.
Okay.
Right.
But but in terms of land use, you can have combined uses, as you pointed out. But could you put an icon on there that emphasizes that for those policymakers that will look at your research and make decisions? For example, in our neighborhood, we have a shopping center covered in solar panels. They're doing that across Denver a lot. And so the land use there is zero, you could say?
However, the big solar farms, the utility scale ones, are not typically put on top of existing land. Right? So they're going out into fields and deploying it.
Yeah, these are, I don't know if you'd call this small, 1,500 panels.
Well, it's by utility standard, that's small. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. But multiple shopping centers, I don't know how many they're doing.
Yeah. But no, I'm a huge advocate for dual use, right? And there are some solar companies that are looking at putting solar farms over the top of landfills, right? So it's property that they're not going to build on,
right.
So why not cover it with solar panels? There's lots of, in Switzerland, they're requiring, sound barriers between highways and people to be put up and solar panels to be on them.
Oh,
right?
even our current president fished out the idea of putting panels on his wall.
He did, yeah. So.
And so I want another big round of applause for Brent. I think he did a very good job on this.